implementation of online assessment that I think a lot of us are now thinking hard about and worried about. But the only reason I agreed to come today is I thought when I was thinking about what I would do with online assessment, I was finding myself going out back to a lot of those, first principles in assessment. What makes assessment good in the first place? And I think going back to those ideas is perhaps a better activity than thinking about what to do in the online environment. And I found, a lot of the answers I was coming up with were the same as what I used to talk a lot about for, just good assessment in general. One thing I did want to point out in the handout is this summer I attended a webinar from Wiley. It's the last reference listed there. And it was a lot about, why are students cheating? How can we address student cheating? How do we combat student cheating? But what they ended up saying is that really the best way to be spending your time and effort? Because they're still going to cheat and they're probably going to outsmart us no matter what we try and do. And so maybe we're wasting our time if we're trying to defeat them from cheating, and maybe we're also giving them a false impression because we're telling them it's worth all our time to try and stop them from cheating, rather than we're more interested in their learning, we're more interested in helping their learning. So I didn't agree with everything they said, but it did really make me think again about how I wanted to kind of approach that assessment. And I also attended another webinar a couple weeks ago that was just saying, one way to kind of combat sharing of answers or answers existing online is just to ask better questions and different kinds of questions. And so that's what I ended up focusing on a little bit more, is just, how do you ask the question better so it's not cheat proof, but hopefully giving you a better insight into what's going on with the students and what they're doing. So we could talk more about those, and you probably have some good examples as well. Or we could talk about projects if you want to talk about more of that, because I think that still has an important, if not more important, role in the COVID environment. I did teach a course this summer online, and I got to the first exam and I was reading their answers and realizing this student needed my feedback on their explanations much before this time, right? So it's a little too late at the first midterm to now be giving them feedback on just the importance of the language and the importance of wording and how to do these interpretations. And then that's what I cared more about than the computations. So the exam was kind of nice that it was, how do you interpret all this output? But I hadn't been giving enough feedback on that. And so that was the other reminder, is whatever you're going to do, build it in so they aren't surprised by the questions that are coming. But you can still do that in a way that the questions you ask them challenge them in new ways, but also prepare them for the kinds of questions. And they've given some practice and you've been able to give them some feedback on that. The other thing I used to say a lot is, if you're not going to have time to give them the feedback, don't collect it from them, don't require it, don't assess them on it. So just looking for ways to give them that more immediate, short-term feedback along the way as well. So that's kind of an overview of what's in there. Any questions, or you want me to keep highlighting some things? Well, while it's in the, go ahead.
Do you have some examples that you might be able to share with us of examples of good ways to pose questions that are relatively cheat-proof?
Not the cheat-proof part, but I'll give you some examples of questions and some types of questions. So the last page of the handout, there's 2 assessment questions there. One's, here's some numbers, calculate these things all the way through a confidence interval, or just find this probability. And I'm not trying to say these are really bad questions. There's definitely some advantages to them. They're probably expecting these kinds of questions. It's very quick for me to grade them and give them feedback. It's not going to cause the students a lot of stress answering these questions. I think that's another thing that's a little bit higher on my priorities. Don't necessarily put them in this timed, really restrictive environment that's just going to stress them out even more, especially if they're worried about the technology not working for them. But I do think they, again, convey to students that all you care about is the calculations. And so if that's not your number 1 priority, students are going to pay a lot of attention to the assessment as far as what they're going to spend their time studying and what they're going to think you value as far as the knowledge. I think there's lots of great examples now of even just adding context to these problems would make them a lot better. but even beyond that, adding a reason for doing these calculations, right? A purpose with that context. And so I do ask a lot more questions now where it's this, and I take a genuine research study. These are the results they found. How can we interpret the results? And one of the other lessons in that webinar about not as much cheat proofing, but maybe having these conversations with students so they don't want to cheat or they see a better way of spending their time than trying to figure out how to cheat. And so if the assessment feels more authentic to them, they know why they're being asked these questions, they feel it's an important question for them to demonstrate their knowledge on, then maybe they're less likely to want to have to cheat on it. Whereas questions that are just, these calculations, I'm not learning from them, I'm not really doing anything other than memorizing answers, they're a little bit more likely to maybe cheat on those. So what I put in the handout, and there's a comment in the chat about the handout. I can drag it over to the chat if anybody doesn't want it. I think I have to close it first though, so let me see if I can do that quickly. So I talked about some different kinds of assessment questions
Beth, I
instead.
wanted to let you know you can share your screen if any time you want to put the handout on the screen.
Yeah, let's do both those things.
I think I gave you permission.
Partly I'm just trying to learn. Oh, and actually, the one I'm putting in here has one more link in it than the one that I sent around. So I open it back up, and now I share. All right, do you see it as well?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So I'm not going to say don't ask any multiple choice questions. I'm going to say maybe don't only ask multiple choice questions, but even within the multiple choice questions, I think you can tweak them up a little bit. So some of the multiple choice answers could be, why are you selecting this response? Or I'm selecting this response for this reason. What did you expect to see? So maybe not generating output as much, but doing some of those predictions and having that be part of the multiple choice. One of my favorite strategies, though, is to give them the multiple choice, trying hard to make sure that the right answer isn't always the longest one, right? But then the follow-up question is, okay, take one of these wrong answers and tell us why it's wrong. And why it's my favorite is I get a lot of insight into the student understanding, and it doesn't cost me that much more grading time. So a completely open-ended question can cost me a lot of grading time. But this a little bit more focused, sure, you can probably pick the right answer and maybe you've memorized it, but can you explain a little bit about why it's right or why another one's wrong? And then a paper that's older now, but I think would be a great one to dig back up, is by Ruth Hubbard from the Journal of Statistics Education, on what I think are sometimes called objective format questions, but again, just lots of different types of questions. So don't just describe a plot, but maybe here's some different ways to describe a plot and which is the best description. And so maybe some of those have context or some of those miss an important feature, something like that. So I didn't feel as much as you're always putting words in their mouths or that they could always guess which was the right answer or which box plot goes with this normal probability plot. Those may not be important topics, but just this idea of a different way of asking questions where they need to kind of think more visually or more conceptually to be able to come up with the answer. Or give them a bunch of two-way tables and see if they can tell you which one has the stronger relationship. Or like here on the handout, which one has a negative correlation? So I'm not going to ask a question that asks you to calculate a correlation. But if you really understand what the correlation coefficient's measuring, this is a pretty easy question. So it requires a different kinds of thinking, but it really helps you understand, do they get the big idea without them spending a lot of time on calculation or just pushing a button on the computer or the calculator. Similarly, this one's super old, you can tell by the graphics, but still one of my favorites. Can you put a lot of things together and just visually decide how you might rank these p-values. So can you think about which ones have bigger differences in groups, but that's not the whole story. That might be partial credit. But if you can also think about how the role of variability plays into that decision and how the sample size plays into that decision. And this is one that I might do more open-ended, because again, it's not going to take them that long to explain, but does allow me to give a fair bit of partial credit. And I would grade it just like how many of those things did they pay attention to, right? If they only paid attention to the medians, that might be not as much credit as somebody who said, maybe got the wrong answer, but the explanation was putting several of those ideas together. So I think what they mean by the objective format is they can still tend to be multiple choice, right? Or maybe you give them part of output and just ask them to fill in missing pieces. So again, that's a lot less time than doing the whole calculations by hand or just running it on the computer and just picking out parts of it. But do they understand how that information is related in the different parts of the output? Another thing I learned this summer is when I did give a all online, mostly multiple choice, is even having just one box at the end where they can explain one of their answers or give some feedback or explain if they read it a slightly different way. That alleviated a lot of their stress. They didn't always use it, but if they did, sometimes, you know, they could have interpreted in a different way that I still want to give them some credit for. And then these are maybe less multiple choice, but again, just different ways of asking questions. So do all your calculations, do all your analysis. Okay, what if they had asked this group of people, how do you think that's going to change things? Or if they'd asked twice as many people, how do you think that's going to change things? So not asking them to do all the calculations again, but just to reason through what those changes would be. One time I went through a phase where I developed a lot of these what went wrong questions, but again, that can be a little bit, I don't know, kinder to the student, is not always criticizing their errors. And I think it's still like a foreign language that you can't always memorize the terminology and expect to use it all correctly when you go to a new country. You need to use the language, you need to practice with it, you need to make a lot of mistakes, and you need to learn from those mistakes. So I think part of it is more creating an environment where they can safely learn from those mistakes. And so what went wrong questions are not always what you did wrong, but here's somebody else's answer. All right, you might have been thinking this. Can you identify how they can improve on this answer? And so that can also be an assessment question. Alan Rothman, and that's another one in the references, he has a website on a blog on Ask Good Questions, right? So he's turned me on to this idea of construct your own example where, you know, maybe the mean's bigger than the median. And you can ask several of these that maybe get progressively harder. But again, trying to focus on, do they understand the idea big enough that these actually don't take them a lot of time? One of his favorite ones is give them a little bit of scaffolding, but then make up your own Simpson's paradox. If you really understand what causes Simpson's paradox, it's not that hard of a question. If you don't totally understand Simpson's paradox, you're going to struggle a fair bit. So, you know, give them a way to reveal whether they have that level of understanding or not. And we're just trying to think about asking questions backwards a little bit. One of my favorites from the Hubbard article is, here's some output. You tell me a research question, or you tell me a situation where this might be the output. So they need to think about things like, well, I'm comparing two means. I found one significantly bigger than another one, you know, and it requires them to think about the information in a little bit different way. So I started using questions like that a lot, or even just kind of more of an essay question. There's also some articles out there about meaningful paragraphs where you need to take the terms and put them all together in a way that makes sense, that you might explain to a grandparent or something like that. Or just describe a situation where you might use statistical inference. And so those are less cheatable, because if everybody explains things to their same grandmother the same way, you're going to notice that pretty quickly. So it does require them to maybe think about coming up with it and again putting it in their own words, I think, a little bit more. But again, these are questions where I wouldn't ask only these types of questions, and I would definitely give them some practice or just some preview that these questions might be coming. So that was my long answer to a few examples. Did that answer the question? And the only problem with sharing my screen is I lose view of the chat. There we go. The one thing I added in here is one more link on projects. So the first few links are the project assignment and the project topics that I used to use in my introductory statistics class. I tended to use a semester-long project with lots of checkpoints along the way. I did make them group projects. I did sometimes do peer reviews, like on the project proposal. I think it's another thing that works really well in the online environment. Another thing I used to advocate a lot is this Island in Schools project, but it seems like this week they're not accepting new teachers or new registrants on it. So I don't have a lot of information on that. I haven't used it in a while. But that was just a virtual environment where they could go in and collect data. And it was kind of nice because they can do genuine experiments that maybe they couldn't do in the real world. The link I added was some projects that my statistics students did in the spring at home in quarantine. So you can see how those topics maybe changed a little bit, but I thought they did a really good idea of coming up with some easy at home data collection. And it wasn't asking a lot of them. A lot of them did exercise and data on themselves, and I was fine with that. Again, I think something that's more real to them is what's most important than it requiring some fancy statistical analysis. So I'll probably do something like that this fall, but maybe in a little bit smaller pieces. Yeah, there's also, Amy is talking about having students use ID numbers, or it's pretty easy these days to kind of randomly generate data for different students. I haven't done as much with that, but there's ways where you can do that where, basically each student's getting their own copy, but in a way that it's easy for you to track the answers. So that's another approach, or just kind of making up numbers, or sometimes I just do slightly different versions of the form. One thing I, again, did a long time ago was I have about 30 data sets where I can ask very similar questions about the data sets. One question is just look at a graph and tell me what you see. One question is compare two groups. Some kids may get means, some kids may get proportions. Another question would be either regression or multiple groups. And I felt that they came out comparable enough that when I was randomly assigning these questions to the students, that I felt pretty good that they were comparable. And I gave them an opportunity not to hire me as a consultant, but I said, okay, you can ask me questions. Eventually you may ask me a question that I'll start to charge you points for. And I'll tell you before I charge you points if you want to retract the question, but a way that they could come and ask me questions if they were getting really stuck on getting started. And that seemed to work pretty well as well, that everybody kind of had their own version. It was much more involved. It was kind of my take-home final. But again, with a way for them to get help a bit if they needed it. And I do a lot, you probably know, with kind of simulation-based inference. And so that also leads to not everybody should get identical p-values. Um, or I may say, tell me what you got in your simulation, but now let's all start with this number, and how would you um, go on from that number? Other questions?
Do you use Google Sheets for simulations?
For simulations, I just use applets. So I can talk a little bit. In the spring, I did try and use a lockdown browser so that all they could go to was my applets. And I even also used Respondus Monitor where I could videotape them while they were taking the exam. And it does a whole room check. You need to show your ID, you need to put your phone away. And it pretty much worked, but had some of these negative, I had to spend so much time getting that set up and telling them how to use it, making sure they used it ahead of time to try and relieve stress on the day of the exam. Some students are still really good about putting their phone, I'm pointing to something, I'm typing into a calculator right now, and you can't really tell that. Or even sending each other messages. So I don't think you can find anything that's cheat proof enough to maybe be worth the energy. But I can ask them questions on applets. I can ask them for screen captures and have them upload that. Or again, I give them output and, just ask them to interpret it. Or if they don't have access to technology, then it's even easier to ask those questions like, well, what would change? What would be different if you increase the sample size? Because I know they can't go just find the answer. They have to logic through it. So what was the original question? So yeah, so I am thinking a little bit about, and other people, some of these webinars will advocate, why not just make it open book? Why not make it open web, right? If you take away those restrictions, then, just think about how to write the questions differently, where if they're spending all their time looking it up, then maybe they don't have time to finish, or they're just not quite finding the way that you talked about it in class, or the level of interpretation that we might be looking for. So that's another kind of different approach to it, I guess.
Yeah, you raised a good point there, because if the question references something discussed in class, then they can't farm the question out to a foreign country.
Yeah, yeah. I used to have students do their presentations, and I would find a lot of my questions from those presentations, right? Or sometimes when I worried that there was loafers on projects, I would say, tell me about your project. And that was a final exam question. And so you could tell if somebody hadn't been paying as much attention to their own project as somebody else. Somebody asked to see this one again. And you're going to ask me what the right answer is, and I'm going to not know off the top of my head. And partly there are issues like the sample size ends up mattering a lot more than you think, right? So even though this one has so much variability, so much less variability, right? The smaller p-value might actually be one that has more variability but bigger sample sizes. So I'm not saying there is one right answer. So again, that doesn't pay to hire out to somebody to tell me the perfect answer. I'm much more interested in that they can explain it and reason through it, and that they're attending to the right factors, right? So I might just say, do they talk about sample size at all? That's a point. Do they talk about variability at all? That's a point. Do they talk about how far apart the means are? That's a point. And I think some of these, the differences in the means or the medians are pretty similar, right? Or maybe somebody says, maybe only focuses on the means and so thinks that's an obvious choice, and so they may not get as much credit as somebody who at least shows me that they know these other factors matter, right? So it's again not asking them a list of factors that matter, but can they apply that in a particular situation? And these violate the rules of being meaningful context and seeing the purposes, but these are much more conceptual than maybe a traditional multiple choice might be. Yeah, Lee's talking about the AP exam, and I haven't heard much. I think Ruth knows more than I do about what's coming up next year. Or I guess I was talking to Gloria. As far as I think it's been announced the reading is virtual, but I don't know what the format on the exam. This year they were allowed to use notes though, right? And the AP's always been kind of good about that as far as at least giving them formulas pages and things like that. They're also not looking for students memorizing things. It's again more applying it. And what was nice about the AP this year is, again, they had to apply it to the whole investigation, right? From beginning to end. There was questions about collecting data, analyzing data, interpreting the results all together with this kind of research study focus, rather than these unrelated bits and pieces that weren't connected to each other. So yeah, a lot of what I'm saying is a bit more geared to my classes and not to the AP and prepping for the AP exam. So I apologize for that. Yeah, if you're seeing Chris Olson said he's heard it's supposed to be normal this year, at least that's the current plan.
Does anyone have other questions they'd like to ask Beth?
Yeah, or
Or maybe,
questions you've used and had really good luck with.
yeah, or maybe share some assessment thoughts from your end, maybe some successes that you've had with assessment.
I actually have a question for Beth. This is Lee.
Okay.
Relative to your projects, I think at one point you mentioned you had like a peer review component or something like that. So can you describe how you did that?
So in the old days, 2 years ago, so this handout has some of the different handouts that I was giving to students. So the first project would be pretty early in the course. Ideally give them time to brainstorm some ideas and think about maybe what they can do, but then eventually they have to submit a proposal, and they're told that that proposal will go to peer review. And so that would be sent out to probably 2 or 3 other students, because these are groups of 3 or 4. So if everybody's reviewing different ones. And what's nice is then everybody in my group has now seen a lot of other people's proposals as well. And that sometimes shows the students who didn't have the best idea that there are some better ideas out there that they're in the same class with. So then students would give comments, and I think one of the things in here, maybe not, I can share with you, I would give them a form to fill out. You know, how well did the group do this? How well did the group do this? And then they would share those comments, and I would usually make it anonymous and hand them back to the groups. I would often look through them in between to make sure that the comments were appropriate. And sometimes I wouldn't always agree. I'd say, well, maybe I don't think you need 1,000 people in your study. You know, you can ignore that one. But I often found that that collection of comments was much, much richer than anything I would have come up with quickly myself. And so I really appreciated them sharing those different perspectives. And that just took, you know, a couple days. It really didn't add that much time to the class. Now we're in Canvas, and you can do all that automatically, where it gets distributed to the students and they type in their comments, and then those all get returned to the project group. What I did last term, but again, this was stat majors, and it was a course on basically doing statistics projects. You know, it was a much more formal protocol. And then at the end, they kind of had to document how they addressed the comments from the reviewers or not. So that's another component you can add as well. Now here's what will be peer reviewed by other students. So I do think the process needs a little bit of monitoring, but again, they tend to be much more demanding than sometimes I am, and so sometimes I have to say, oh no, let's make this, keep this realistic. And I think that's the main thing of these multiple checkpoints, is make sure it's rich enough that if you want them to do a 2-sample test at the end, that they're going to have groups that they can compare, but also not so complicated that they're not going to be able to analyze the data once they're done. And so just kind of finding that sweet spot in between, that there'll be something to talk about but not overwhelming them. And I do give them an option for a rough draft. Very few groups actually would take me up on it. But that's another thing that, as we're changing our assessments and as we're trying to be more flexible with students this year, is, you know, maybe more opportunities for revision. But I would plan that carefully in advance so you don't end up overwhelming yourself with having to reread lots of drafts of the same ideas. So, you know, maybe one revision or something, and give them specific deadlines for it. That's what works better for me anyway, and as far as keeping track of everything and updating scores. Also on the projects, I did tend to have them evaluate each other. And I know a colleague who does these collaborative keys with even weekly assignments. So she puts them into groups, and they're supposed to collaborate and come up with a group assignment. And I think this collaboration is still critical to try and maintain, because when I used to give paired quizzes in my regular classroom, when they were arguing with each other to come up with one answer, that's where I felt they learned 80% of the material, right? Not anything I said, but when they had to agree and come up with something. So if you can find ways to keep that collaboration, but then maybe you want to build in a little bit of checking that they're doing it. And so she does a lot more kind of peer reviews, and these can be, again, real quick. I was doing, you know, weekly surveys on just how's it going, you know, just a couple questions. What can I do differently? Did this person collaborate with you? You know, just little quick check-ins. It can be very short and easy, again, online to distribute. And you can choose if you want to make them anonymous or not. Can be helpful as well. Accountability was the word I was looking for earlier. But yeah, try and build in a little bit of that if you can.
Beth, I noticed that Ruth raised her hand.
Ooh,
So
I can't see that.
yeah, thought Ruth might want to comment.
You're muted, Ruth.
Unmuted myself, and I muted myself. I used peer review and critiquing for the first time seriously this past winter, and then extended it into the spring when we were quarantined. So what I had each group do, and I spent a lot more time on the project submission and having them critique each other. So I actually made a project submission thing where they had to tell me for their idea, you know, what was your explanatory variable? What was your response? What kind of data is it? How will you analyze it? What will the graphs look like? And then they start to realize, oh wait, we were asked to do something to compare to categorical variables, and they're not categorical or something. So that got through a lot of those. But what I did this past winter was, so I'm looking at my handout in front of me now, but there was lots of different places throughout it where, so I paired groups. So each group had a partner group. And so in each step of the way, they had to do it in Google Docs, and the other group had to critique it by a certain day. So by a certain day, they had to critique it, and then there was the end date, and they got points for everything that they sort of got a grade. The group critiquing got a grade for finding things that were helpful, and they kind of lost points, not terribly, but it was sort of to keep them really actually looking hard at other people's things if I found things that were glaring that they didn't find. And so they really did write nice, thoughtful things all along the way. So I've had the biggest success in spending a lot of time on what it is they're going to do their project on, and putting them in groups and having them critique it and say, well, yeah, that sounds good, but how will this work? But you might want to look at it this way instead. And it got everybody to a place where their questions were much better. And just one other thing, and then I'll get off, is that what I also started doing, I get tired of kids saying, you're marking things wrong because you only want me to say what you want me to say. And I said it correctly. And so what I would start doing is, so what I would start doing is when I collected their test, I would scan them all, and then the different types of egregious things, I would copy them, but I wouldn't use them that year. I'd save them to the next year, and that would be our practice before the test is, okay, this person thought they should get full credit. I didn't give them full credit. Why not? What can you find wrong here? So you're not actually having to come up with writing stuff, because every time you give an assessment, you know those things happen, right? And so sort of like Beth said, you don't want anybody to feel like you're saying, oh, you're wrong. So you just save it for the next year's class. And it makes a good practice test. Thanks.
Yeah, or along those lines, sometimes on exam 2, I'll say, tell me something you learned from exam 1, right? And so partly you're teaching them, to self-reflect, right? But to learn, these exams aren't all summative in the end of the story, but it is a progressive process. And that also individualizes it and personalizes it a bit more as well. Joel asked about a website tool that you use the most in stats. There's so many now all of a sudden. Is it overwhelmed to get through them all? And I admit I haven't been keeping up. Amy mentioned one about fake data. There's one I've been using in this other class that might be useful called Monday Morning Makeover. I can look at that when somebody else is talking. But it finds some graphs that are not so great. They're not horrible, but especially now, I think Roxy, you were the one saying that USA Today, we can't pick on them anymore because they're actually a little bit better now. But it takes some graphs and it takes the story that goes with it, and it gives you access to the data. All right, and so you can say, students, here's the data. You make a more appropriate graph, or you make a more misleading graph, or you make a better graph that matches the headline that they were trying to use. And so that's another way to kind of keep it hands-on and individual as well. So I've just kind of used that as a little mini project. I'm very grateful nowadays that I have applets. I'm probably going to use them a lot more than statistical software, and I find they're pretty easy for students to be using on their own. I do like to have a collection that's fairly consistent in the look and feel rather than picking and choosing a bunch of different applets. I can make web pages where they're all kind of integrated, or you can even, I think, integrate them in some of these online modules. So the instructions for the applet are right there. And again, with screen captures or even just taking pictures and uploading those, it's pretty easy for them to share their work on those. And my son's trying to teach me about OBS, which is what all the gamers use to videotape them playing the game. And so that's another way where, they can send me a little video of how they used it. Or I'm doing a little bit more with Flipgrid, where I'm thinking about asking them to, after pick on 3 people, randomly assign 3 people, give me a 5-minute summary about today's lesson, record that in Flipgrid, which is a minute and a half, right? And then other students can see that, and other students will do it at different terms. So again, they're being required to talk about statistics at least twice during the quarter. So I think some of those tools are worth looking into, but to be honest, I'm not going to do a ton more than what I've been doing. Chris, do you want to say anything more about the Artistat applets?
Oh, I'm just putting in a plug for the Artistat applets. I'm very biased toward these applets, but they're open source, and I know that Bernhard and I would love for you to use these applets.
In the Census at School data, thank you, because I wanted to mention that as well, because they have that thing where you can randomly generate a different sample kind of for each student, and they can spit it out into a worksheet or an exam page, and then you can distribute it that way, and they can make a version for you that has the answers as well. So that's probably where I'd go to now that the islands maybe isn't working, as far as just getting some real data, and you can get copies of the surveys. So these were originally surveys aimed at elementary, middle school, high school students in all kinds of different countries throughout the world. So it's also like Money Street. Somebody type in a link from Money Street, please. Where you can get raw data from real people and the story behind it, and you can have your students take the same survey, and then you can compare your results to that survey as well. And then anything with Gapminder, I think there's a lots of good stuff there as well.
Yeah, Gapminder's great.
So yeah, hopefully we weren't still overwhelming you. Anybody else have successes they want to share?
I just wanted to pick up on what you said earlier about arguing as being an effective way of formative assessment. I couldn't agree more. I teach at a school that's all boys, and when they get arguing, it can go on for a long time, but there's some really effective learning that happens in that argument process.
Yeah, so just keeping it focused.
I haven't had any come to blows since the late 90s.
The other thing you can do pretty easily now is go to 2 different news websites and get 2 pretty opposite headlines, and turns out that they're probably based on the same survey, right? If they like come out the same day. So different ways of interpreting the same survey. And so I think that's interesting to give to students and talk about, is one of these lying to you, or, you know, what can they say from this data? There's also articles on finding the findings, where giving them the, kind of similar to what we were talking about with the graphs, but, you know, giving them the news article, asking them to go find, because asking them to look something up in the computer, they'll be all over that. So ask them to go find the original source of the study, and then see if they agree with what was selected out for the headline. Was that the purpose of the study? Do you think that's an appropriate conclusion? Again, I can share a worksheet I used to use with that, with a set of questions. I know Jessica Utz, especially Seeing Through Statistics, also has some great sets of questions that you can ask along with a news article. And, you know, did they identify who the study involved, how many were in the study, you know, those kinds of you know, checkpoint questions. Okay, Monday morning makeover. I call it Monday morning graphics, but that's not right. Makeover Monday?
Yeah, I wasn't quite sure. I couldn't seem to find it. Makeover Monday.
No. I mean, I got it out of this book.
If I found the website, I'll see if I can pull it back up.
Get it in there.
Yeah.
The SNAF, no, I'm all lost. Yeah, that looks right. Thank you, Rob. And it goes back lots of years. So I'm going to a whole new set this year than I did last year. You know, so it's usually very current, and it's not very involved. There's parts on the website where people can submit their own suggestions, and that's how I think people getting into data science are sometimes building up a portfolio. But I tend to kind of ignore that. I just kind of give my students the data, and there's some free graphics things like Data Wrapper, you know, and they can just upload their data into that. I don't think that's necessary. I think our regular tools are fine. Oh yes, I did want to say a little bit more on the collaboration. Both from the student's point of view, so as we've already talked about getting them to debate with each other, but also just encouraging you to share with each other. I never give an exam without making Ellen or Roxy read it first. And just sharing resources, and you know, if we can ask these questions that we don't mind, if they kind of know the questions coming, then a lot more of us can use some of the same questions and compare results and things like that. But I also think that idea of transparency and being very clear to them how these things are being graded is really important as well. And then even with these, you know, more open-ended questions, if you've got a nice simple rubric, then you can still get through them pretty quickly. And then all these books are just where I used to steal a lot of my questions from, are listed down here. I didn't put years or publishers because they're pretty old, but you can probably find something online or get a free version or a publisher's version still. The only one that's a little bit different here is Ramsey and Schaefer. It's aimed at graduate students in a second course in statistics. But again, it's a great example of focusing on the interpretation, not just the calculation. Oh, and this extensions assignment is something that I do occasionally, where what I did in the spring or winter before we went offline was, before we went online, at some point this term, you have to come up with 2 examples of statistics outside of this class. And so before it was pretty easy because they would maybe just go to a talk on campus and talk about how somebody misused the statistics. At this time, I sent them some articles and said, maybe you want to dig a little deeper on this topic, or maybe one was we do, you know, dog sniffing cancer on in one of the examples in class, and then say, well, why isn't this the diagnostics tool that everybody uses? And maybe go read this article and talk about how it relates to what we talked about in class. You know, so those could be very everyday person articles, but then how does that relate to what we talked about in class? And so it was pretty much you did it or you didn't do it. And I think everybody did it. It wasn't a huge amount of points, but if you put points on it, they'll do it. And I really do think they got something out of it. And even better would be to share them with each other and have them see all these different applications of statistics. And it was a pretty, what do you want to call it, low effort assignment that I thought had some value to it. Yeah, Amy also mentioned what's going on with this graph. And that's another one where you get access to discussion. I don't know if you always get access to the data, but again, they find really good graphs that have something to talk about. And again, very current events. And then the Locus Project that Chris is mentioning also allows you to select, I should have put it here with the artist one. What both of these allow you to do is there's a collection of questions that people have decided are pretty good questions. And then you can kind of pick and choose, and you can search on, I really just need a question about mean versus median tomorrow, right? And you can download a question and use it. And both of them, but I think Locus even more so, will give you access to how others have been doing on the assessments. And so you can kind of compare. And Locus has both multiple choice and open-ended, but both these do, but I usually steal the multiple choice. And some of these I ask at the beginning and the end of the course and do a little bit of self-assessment on what they're getting out of the course too. And so I do try and keep them fairly secure, but I really think the best use of items like these, especially items that require students to think a little bit, that don't have obvious answers, is as discussion in class. And, you know, have everybody do it, have a majority get it wrong. You don't have to identify people by name again, but then that's your discussion point for class that day. And I think that's a great use. If you have a little bit of Zoom time with them or synchronous time with them, I think just going over some of these common misconceptions that maybe these subtle issues that maybe they might not get out of the reading, I think is a better use of that time than, again, you just demonstrating something perfectly correctly.
Beth, I was going to mention with the Locus Project, they actually have exams that are already set up that you can sign up as an instructor and utilize those exams with your students, maybe as a pre-assessment before the semester starts, and then they give you feedback. It's like a report on the areas of the 4 components of the statistical investigative cycle where your students maybe are the weakest, doing the strongest. So you might want to check out the website just to maybe come up with some pre-assessments to give your students as well.
Well, another thing from the pre-assessments is I've stopped asking some of the questions because I realized they already know it coming in, and that's happening more and more as we are getting more statistics in lower grade levels.
Which is a good thing. They also have it to where you can have questions with the gaze, maybe from the beginning to intermediate. You could do an intermediate to an advanced, but you can also do all 3 levels, beginning, intermediate, and advanced. So they have different selections you can use.
Yeah, and if you can, I don't want to say identify students, but that's also a way to tailor. Maybe some students need this background that other students have seen. And so it's a way to, again, kind of individualize what different students will have access to. I used to always teach my intro-stat courses for stat majors with both R and jump, and I always trying to figure out, how do I talk about R for 20 minutes? How do I talk about jump for 5 minutes and still have my 50-minute lecture? So I'm actually looking forward to, I'm going to have an office hour for the R people at this time and for the jump people at this time. So I think there's some advantages to being able to kind of split things up a little bit more and tailor to the students. And again, I think that's where the assessment can really, really help, is identify, you know, much more individualized feedback for students. And my advice is try not to do things for fall. Try and take this opportunity to do things that you'll keep using even after fall, right? Or even after this year, and just try and save your time that way. So what did I say that you didn't agree with?
It's quiet.
Yeah.
Do we have other comments? Other things you could share? Questions for Beth? Well, Beth, I want to thank you. This has been wonderful, and we have a wealth of resources that we can utilize as well. And it's wonderful to hear the different things that the different strategies, the different ways that people are approaching formative and summative assessment, which is, I think, an area that we think about least. You know, we worry so much about how we're going to deliver the curriculum. It's always felt like that assessment is an afterthought. And it's really nice to see that people are thinking more about the assessment piece, because it is really part of the learning. It's not punishment, but it's part of the student learning, and ways to make it that way.
I sometimes threaten to make every day a quiz day, just because they pay more attention to it, right?
Yeah.
And you can give them the feedback.
That's right.
That may be too far, but yeah, I agree it has an important role.
But we really do appreciate this. This is just great, and the handout and all the different resources we've talked about. I think we got enough to keep everybody busy for at least a little while this fall.
Yeah, and if there's something I referred to that I didn't put in the resources, feel free to email me. I did not put that in the handout, but my email address is just bchance@calpoly.
Okay. Well, we need to think about our next chat. Chris, are you still on? Chris Olson?
He is.
He is. Chris Olson has.
Oh, yeah, I'm here.
Yes. Chris Olson has some open source software that he has graciously agreed to share with us at our next chat. And Chris, do you want to give a teaser to everybody? And then they will be anxiously awaiting to join the next chat.
Your elevator pitch.
Yeah,
The elevator pitch.
or maybe scare everybody away.
No, don't scare them away. This is the teaser to get them to come back.
Well, let's see. The teaser, I guess, would be for those that have for high school people that have administrators who don't believe it's important to have software in a statistics class. This is free. Doesn't cost a thing. It's hopefully it's written so that those who know me know I'm really a JUMP fan. I mean, I just think the world of JUMP. But what I've tried to do is write something that is more elementary. It doesn't do all of that stuff, so it's simpler for the cherubs in class, and they can focus on the statistics and let the software just recede into the background and make it how shall I disappear in a sense. Well, maybe a teaser would be that in the software I have put little snide remarks where when students make errors, they get little error messages that hopefully are interesting, but are perhaps not normal. So you can just come and see all of those remarks that students get when they make errors.
Can I try a joke? So I've been trying to make our applets satisfy the, accessibility compliance, and we have some error messages like you're talking about, where it instead of just putting in your data and getting a p-value, you have to kind of put in the right number to get a p-value. And so sometimes the software will say, are you sure that's the number you wanted to use? And the accessibility are like, well, that error message isn't helpful enough. So maybe if I made them snide remarks, that would make them happier.
Well, Beth, that actually was some of my thinking, and not to knock Minitab, but that's what we use in our shop here. And so often something pops up that says, well, you messed up, but there's no clue what to do. So I've tried to put in, okay, look, you messed up, you need to do this. So they're actually intended to be helpful to the students more than what I see in usual professional software.
Well, Chris, I can't wait. Your pitch was right on the money. Well, we need to set our next date. I guess the big question is, do you want to do this in 2 weeks or 3 weeks? We sometimes go every 2 weeks. Sometimes we go every 3 weeks. How does everybody feel? You want to do 2 weeks? 3 weeks? Should I just set the date? 3 weeks. Amy, 3. I'm seeing some 3s. Okay, 3 weeks it is. I've seen enough.
Chris?
So that's,
oh, sorry.
Yes.
Can I share in the chat a webinar that Beth and I are presenting
Yes.
next Wednesday? Okay.
Yes, please do. Yeah, I see all 3. So I think I'm going to go with 3 weeks. So 3 weeks, is that the 24th of September?
Okay.
I believe that's the 24th.
Yes, 24th.
Okay, 24th. Okay, so why don't we say the 24th at 4 p.m. Eastern time, same time. How's that sound? Chris, be sure you mark your calendar. And I will remind you, Chris. And in the chat, you can see the webinar that Beth and Ruth are going to be presenting. This sounds really exciting. Keeping students engaged in the statistical process in face-to-face, hybrid, and virtual environments. This sounds wonderful. So any other comments before we sign off? We're 3 minutes from 5 o'clock, so we'll stay within our hour. I know you're all very, very busy as schools whether you've started school or getting ready to school. I guess many of you will be starting after Labor Day, correct? Yeah, some of you. Well, thank you for joining us. Thank you again, Beth, for sharing so much with us. This was really wonderful, and it really gave us a lot to think about.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, please keep coming and joining us. You don't have to be presenting, just come join us.
Thank you.
And I will plan on seeing all of you hopefully in 3 weeks. So I'm going to sign off.
Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you.
I turned